The storm had come without warning, a wild symphony of thunder and rain tearing across the sky as if heaven itself wanted to cleanse the earth of its darkest secrets. The river, swollen and furious, devoured the land around it with merciless hunger, and in its grasp a young woman struggled against the weight of betrayal. Her name was Abigail Reed, and on that night her life was not only threatened by the torrent, but reshaped by fate's unyielding hand. Her stepfather's shadow still lingered in her memory, his voice, his rage, the cruel twist of his decision that flung her into the water like a burden to be discarded. Yet even in the blackest abyss, light found her, though it came in the shape of a stranger's hand, strong, weathered, determined, pulling her back from the edge of nothingness. Abigail's chest burned as she gasped against the current, and just before darkness consumed her, she glimpsed a pair of storm-grey eyes, silver-streaked hair plastered by rain, and the strength of a man who refused to let her slip away. The river roared, the sky cracked, and she was carried into the unknown, not realizing she had crossed into the very heart of a story that would test every fragment of her soul. Morning broke upon Redemption Valley, Montana, in the year 1877, a place where the scars of war still festered and silence held secrets sharper than any blade. Within this land, men carried grudges like weapons, and women like Abigail bore the weight of survival with quiet endurance. She awoke days later in the solitude of a ranch house, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the sweetness of honeyed broth, her body fragile but her spirit still alive. The man who saved her, Samuel Blackwood, watched her with eyes heavy from both past battles and present worry, as though she were not just a stranger, but a ghost returned to him. Outside, the mountains stretched like guardians, ancient and unyielding. Inside, between the four walls of Samuel's home, something delicate began to take root. In his care, Abigail found not only warmth and healing, but the unsettling pull of recognition. His gaze lingered as though he had seen her before, in another life, through another face. She carried her mother's memory in her eyes, and in those moments, the silence between them spoke louder than words. The truth hovered, fragile and aching, like a letter waiting to be opened. In town, whispers spread like wildfire. Jeremiah Sullivan, owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon and a man rotted by bitterness, searched with fury for his stepdaughter. Sheriff Monroe, with his badge polished brighter than his honor, bent the law to Sullivan's will. And Silas Reed, outlaw with scarred lips and cruelty in his blood, waited for the chance to claim what he believed owed. Each of these men circled Abigail's fate like vultures, unaware that the girl they sought was under the protection of the very man who had once loved her mother more fiercely than life itself. For Abigail, every breath in Samuel's house was borrowed time. Dreams of San Francisco, of freedom, of a seamstress's shop with blue curtains, seemed impossibly distant, yet clung to her heart like a beacon. Each night, storms rumbled in her memory, a reminder of the moment she chose to fight for her life. Each morning, as Samuel placed bread on the table, as his steady hands tended to her fever, she felt the stirring of something she could not yet name. Was it trust? Was it destiny? Or was it the awakening of a truth buried beneath years of silence and deceit? You, dear listener, step closer now. Walk with Abigail along the fragile bridge between despair and hope. Feel the trembling courage in her chest as she dares to defy the man who called himself her guardian. Allow the story's rhythm to wash over you like rain after drought, soothing, healing, carrying you deeper into a world where love is tested, where loyalty bends, and where secrets lie waiting beneath the ashes of war. If these words stir something quiet within you, if they remind you of your own hidden battles, your own longing for healing, let your heart answer gently. A like, a comment, a simple subscription becomes more than support. It is a candle lit in the dark, a way of saying this story matters, that her voice will not be silenced. For in the days to come, Abigail will find herself standing at the crossroads of past and future, where one man's betrayal collides with another's devotion, and the truth of blood and love will demand to be known. And so, with the storm still echoing in her bones, and the warmth of Samuel's home cradling her fragile body, she takes the first step into the path fate has laid before her. The journey has only begun, and already the air is heavy with promise, like the hush before lightning cleaves the sky. The days that followed her awakening passed in a rhythm that felt both fragile and strangely eternal, like a flame flickering yet refusing to go out. Abigail remained within the quiet embrace of Samuel Blackwood's ranch, a place far removed from the smoke-filled saloon and the poisonous gazes that had long haunted her life. The house was small, built with practicality rather than ornament, but every corner seemed touched by the man's steady presence, his tools lined in neat order, his shelves filled with well-read books, his hearth warm and alive even in silence. To Abigail, it was a sanctuary, a healing pause offered by fate itself, though shadows of fear still lingered at the edges of her mind. Samuel moved about the house with a gentleness that belied his weathered form. He brewed herbal teas, placed broth by her side, and never once allowed her to feel like a burden. His hands, rough from years of work, carried the same quiet steadiness as his voice, and whenever she caught him glancing at her, she sensed something unspoken, a recognition too deep to be explained away. He would lower his eyes quickly, but not before she saw it, that flicker of storm and memory bound together. It made her heart tremble with questions she dared not ask. Outside, the land itself seemed to breathe with her recovery. The valley stretched wide, wrapped in the healing hush of pine-scented air and the endless Montana sky. Mornings carried the scent of dew, evenings the glow of sunsets that spilled across the mountains in gold and crimson, painting everything in colors of promise. Abigail, frail though she still was, began to draw strength from these simple wonders. She would rest by the window, watching clouds drift and hawks circle high above, and it felt as though each breath of clean air washed something broken inside her, soothing wounds not only of body, but of spirit. Healing, she realized, was not only in broth and blankets, but in silence, in space, in being allowed to exist, without fear of who might reach for her wrist or demand her obedience. Yet even in such moments of calm, she could not escape the echoes of Sullivan's hand forcing her into the river, nor Reed's gaze that night at the saloon. Their voices crept into her thoughts, reminders that her freedom was fragile, that danger prowled beyond the edges of this quiet haven. She would wake at night, heart racing, as if the storm itself still roared outside, only to find Samuel seated by the fire, his profile etched against the glow. He never asked about her dreams, never pressed her to speak of the terror she carried, but his presence was an answer in itself. He was there, unwavering, and that was enough. As strength returned, Abigail began to move about the house, offering small contributions in gratitude. She mended one of Samuel's shirts, its fabric worn thin, but kept carefully by him as though it meant more than mere clothing. She prepared simple meals when her hands stopped trembling enough to slice bread without fear of dropping the knife. Each act gave her a sense of belonging, fragile but real, and she felt threads weaving quietly between them, threads of care, of shared silence, of something that resembled family, though neither dared to name it aloud. One afternoon, when sunlight fell soft through the shutters and dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the air, Abigail ventured outside for the first time since the river. Samuel guided her, his hand steady on her elbow, though she insisted she could manage. The air was cool, touched with the scent of rain lingering in the soil, and the wide valley opened before her like a page waiting to be written upon. She drew in a deep breath, letting the freshness fill her chest, and for the first time in years she felt a fragile hope flutter where despair had once rooted itself. They walked slowly toward the pasture where Samuel's horses grazed beneath the watch of towering cottonwoods. The animals lifted their heads at her approach, ears flicking, eyes curious but kind. Samuel introduced each by name, his voice low and affectionate, and Abigail was struck by the warmth that softened his features as he spoke to them. Here was a man who carried scars from war and solitude, yet he still spoke to his creatures as if they were companions, not possessions. Healing flowed quietly in that moment, not only for her, but for him as well. As the days stretched into weeks, fragments of Samuel's past began to surface in small details. A medical text left open on the table revealed notes in his careful hand, drawings of anatomy marked with a soldier's urgency. A framed photograph tucked within a trunk bore the likeness of a woman with hair the same shade as Abigail's, eyes deep and familiar. She did not press him for answers, though curiosity gnawed at her. Instead, she allowed the mystery to rest, sensing that time itself would bring forth what needed to be known. In return, she shared pieces of herself. Stories of her mother, Clara's laughter, of sewing dreams spun late at night, of imagining a life in San Francisco far away from redemption's cruelty. Samuel listened in silence, his expression unreadable yet deeply intent, as if each word she spoke was a fragment of a puzzle long scattered. Sometimes she caught him closing his eyes when she mentioned Clara, as though her mother's memory was both balm and wound. Abigail felt it too, the absence like a hollow ache. But in sharing, it seemed less heavy, softened by the knowledge that someone else remembered, that her mother's name did not vanish into silence. The town beyond the ranch still breathed with menace. Word reached them through Martha Hawkins, Samuel's neighbor, that Sullivan raged at Abigail's disappearance, spreading lies about stolen money, whispering poison to Sheriff Monroe and Reed alike. Sullivan's reach was wide, his power built not only on coin but on fear, and Abigail knew her safety was fragile. Yet within Samuel's walls there was a strange serenity, a pause from pursuit. She began to believe she might gather enough strength to face what lay ahead, not merely survive, but perhaps even carve out a new beginning. Nights by the fire became their sanctuary. Samuel would mend tack or polish tools, while Abigail read aloud from books she found on his shelves. Emerson, Shakespeare, poetry that stirred something in her chest. The rhythm of her voice filled the quiet house, and Samuel's occasional smile was enough to remind her that even in a world scarred by violence, tenderness endured. Sometimes, when the fire burned low and shadows deepened, they spoke of healing, not only of bodies but of hearts, of how wounds unseen often took the longest to mend. Samuel said little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of lived truth. And so, though danger lingered and secrets waited like storms behind mountains, Abigail found herself slowly returning to life. The bruises of fear remained, but warmth threaded through the days, stitching her brokenness with threads of care. In Samuel's presence, she felt not only rescued, but seen. And though she could not yet name the bond forming between them, she knew it mattered. It mattered more than the threats circling outside, more than the lies Sullivan whispered in town. As the sun dipped low one evening, painting the valley in shades of rose and amber, Abigail stood at the porch and closed her eyes. The air was cool against her skin, the sound of crickets rising in chorus, the world softening into night. For a moment she felt free, not a saloon girl, not Sullivan's possession, not Reed's prey. Just herself, a woman breathing, healing, waiting on the edge of a truth that would one day rise like dawn. And with Samuel beside her, silent but unwavering, she believed that whatever storms still gathered, she would not face them alone. The valley hushed into twilight, and beyond the horizon redemption still stirred with its restless shadows. But here, in the small house lit by firelight and guarded by memory, Abigail had taken her first true steps toward a new beginning. And though she did not yet know it, the path she walked was already carrying her toward revelations that would shatter the lies of her past and bind her fate to Samuel's in ways neither could yet imagine. The night deepened, and with it came the promise of what lay ahead, fragile but undeniable, waiting just beyond the next dawn. The storm that had nearly claimed her life seemed to linger in Abigail's memory long after her body had begun to heal. Nights found her restless, slipping between dreams and waking, haunted by the thunder of Sullivan's voice and the laughter of Reed's men. Yet each morning when the light touched the valley, she rose to find herself wrapped not in chains of fear, but in the quiet steadiness of Samuel's world. The ranch was both refuge and reminder, a place where silence offered space to breathe, to mend, to remember who she truly was beneath the weight of others' cruelty. Samuel rarely pressed her for words, but his presence was constant, like the steady hum of the river beyond the fields, like the warmth of the hearth even when the fire was low. He carried the air of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, and yet still managed to hold the fragile threads of kindness close to his heart. In him, Abigail found not only protection, but the subtle assurance that she was more than the sum of her bruises. His quiet care was healing in its own way, not loud or insistent, but woven into every gesture, the way he set bread beside her without speaking, the way he adjusted the quilts around her shoulders when she drifted asleep by the fire, the way his eyes softened whenever she spoke of her mother. It was in those moments, when her voice trembled with memory, that she saw something stir within him, something older than grief, deeper than longing. Samuel listened not as a stranger, but as though he carried pieces of her past within himself, as though Clara's name carved new lines across his weathered face each time it was spoken. Abigail did not yet know the truth that lay buried between them, but her heart felt the pull of recognition, the quiet ache of something waiting to be revealed. One afternoon, when the skies were clear and the air smelled of pine, Abigail walked further from the house than she had dared before. Samuel accompanied her, his stride measured so she would not tire. They reached a meadow where wildflowers grew in bursts of yellow and purple, bending gently in the wind. She sank into the grass, her skirts spreading like a blue shadow around her, and for the first time since childhood she felt the earth embrace her without judgment. The healing was not only in rest, but in remembering beauty, the way the sun scattered gold across her skin, the way a lark's song carried through the valley like a hymn. Samuel stood nearby, silent, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. When their eyes met, it was as if the years between his grief and her longing collapsed, leaving only the raw recognition of two souls who had both lost more than they ever should have. Abigail's heart carried scars of its own making. She had spent years in Sullivan's saloon, enduring the stares, the whispers, the hands that reached without permission. Each night she had swallowed her pride for survival, each day counting the coins she hid away for the dream of San Francisco, a dream she clung to like a talisman against despair. Now, in Samuel's care, that dream did not feel as distant, though doubt lingered. Could she truly escape the shadow of Redemption Valley? Could she walk into a new life free of Sullivan's reach? She wanted to believe so, and in Samuel's quiet strength she found reasons to hope. But shadows moved even in daylight. Martha Hawkins, Samuel's neighbor, arrived one evening with tidings from town. She brought with her the scent of dust and distance, her grey eyes sharp, her voice edged with truth. Sullivan had been raging through redemption, spinning lies of theft and betrayal, telling any who would listen that Abigail had stolen from him before fleeing. Reed's men prowled the streets, and Sheriff Monroe's badge gleamed in places it had no right to be. To the town, Abigail was no longer simply missing. She was branded fugitive, traitor to the man who claimed to have raised her. Abigail listened in silence, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. Each lie Sullivan spoke was a blade, slicing away the fragile sense of self she had begun to rebuild. But when she lifted her eyes, she found Samuel's gaze steady upon her, his voice low yet unyielding. "Truth will not remain buried forever," he said, and the conviction in his words was enough to hold her trembling spirit still. Martha, with the blunt wisdom of one who had weathered her own storms, squeezed Abigail's hand and added, "Child, no man's lies can define you. You are not his possession, not his shadow. You are your mother's daughter, and that is enough." That night, Abigail sat by the fire long after the others had gone to bed. She traced the rim of a cup in her hands, watching the flames shift and crackle, carrying her thoughts into the dark. The healing she sought was not only of body but of soul, and it would not come from hiding forever. She knew Sullivan would not rest until he had her under his grasp again, or worse. But here in Samuel's house, she also knew she was no longer alone. For the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to be seen as something more than a pawn, more than a prize. As dawn crept over the mountains, Abigail whispered a promise to herself, one born of both pain and new-found strength. She would not return to chains, no matter how they threatened. The days ahead would demand courage and perhaps sacrifice. But the storm had already taught her she was stronger than she believed. She had survived the river, survived betrayal, and within Samuel's steady presence she was learning that healing was not surrender. It was defiance, a quiet declaration that her spirit could not be broken. The valley stirred with morning light, and somewhere in the distance redemption waited, restless and cruel. But Abigail, standing in the doorway of the ranch, felt the weight of the horizon less heavy than before, for in her heart there was a glimmer, fragile yet radiant, of a new dawn rising, not only for herself, but for the truth that would one day set her free. And as the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and rain across the fields, she stepped forward, unaware that fate was already moving to test the fragile peace she had found, carrying her closer to the revelations that would change everything. The air within Samuel's house carried a stillness that was almost sacred, the kind of hush that feels born of both safety and secrets. Abigail had begun to walk more freely through the rooms, her steps light against the wooden floors, her lungs no longer burning with the remnants of pneumonia. Yet with every breath she drew, the shadow of the past clung to her, and with it came the awareness that her life in Redemption Valley had changed forever. She could not return to the saloon. She could not slip back into the role Sullivan had carved for her. The river had washed her clean of that prison, though scars remained. Healing was steady, and in Samuel's presence she found herself gathering courage as if each word he spoke was a stone placed in the foundation of her resolve. One evening, while twilight softened the valley in strokes of lavender and rose, Samuel returned from the barn carrying the scent of hay and the dust of the earth. Abigail sat by the fire, her chestnut hair loose over her shoulders, a book resting across her knees. She looked up at him with a small smile, and in that moment Samuel felt as if Clara's ghost sat there too, her features reborn in the daughter he had not known was his. The weight of the truth pressed against him with every passing day, the photograph hidden in his trunk whispering of the past, the letter he had never received gnawing at his heart. He longed to speak, to tell Abigail of the suspicion rising inside him, yet fear held his tongue. She was fragile still, both in body and spirit, and he could not bear to wound her further with truths that might feel like storms. Abigail, for her part, sensed something in Samuel's silence. His gaze lingered on her too long, his voice softened when he spoke her name, and though she could not name the bond that tied them, she felt its thread winding around her heart. It was not the gaze of a man seeking to possess or consume. It was something deeper, more healing, like sunlight after rain. She cherished it quietly, storing the feeling like coins hidden beneath the floorboards of her heart, a wealth far greater than any Sullivan could ever dangle before her. The next day, Martha Hawkins arrived once more, her shawl damp from the mist, and her sharp eyes carrying tidings from town. She entered without hesitation, embracing Abigail with the warmth of a mother and the firmness of one who had seen too many winters to waste words. News spread through Redemption like wildfire, she said. Sullivan had told the townsfolk that Abigail was a thief, a runaway who had stolen from his saloon. Worse still, he claimed she had fled with a man, sullying her reputation in a way that left no room for defense. Abigail's heart twisted at the lies, yet her spirit no longer bowed beneath them. With Martha's hand wrapped around hers, and Samuel's silent fury burning in the hearth of his eyes, she found a strange strength rise within her. Lies were heavy, but truth was heavier still, and one day it would surface. That night, Samuel sat across from Abigail at the table, the flicker of candlelight throwing shadows across the wood. He watched her hands as she folded the hem of a dress Martha had brought, small stitches pulling fabric into wholeness. It was a simple act, yet one that mirrored what was happening within her, the slow sewing together of a soul torn by years of betrayal. He wanted to tell her everything, of Clara, of the past, of the love he had lost, and the possibility that she was the living embodiment of it. But the words refused to cross his lips. Instead, he said softly, "You remind me of someone I once loved, more than life itself." Abigail lifted her gaze, her eyes deep as the mountain lakes beyond the valley, and in them Samuel saw both Clara and the promise of all that could be healed if only time allowed. Sleep that night came slowly. Abigail lay beneath Samuel's quilt, the scent of pinewood and smoke wrapping her like a lullaby. Her dreams were not of storms, but of her mother's voice, gentle as a hymn, whispering promises of freedom. When she woke, the dawn painted her room in pale gold, and for the first time in years she felt not the dread of another day's servitude, but the tender stirring of hope. Healing was no longer only survival, it was possibility, but possibility could not hide forever. That afternoon, while Samuel mended a harness outside, the distant echo of hoofbeats reached their ears. Abigail froze, her hand clutching the doorframe, the memory of pursuit returning in a flood. Samuel's expression hardened, and he moved with deliberate calm to the edge of the yard. The rider was Sheriff Monroe, his badge catching the light like a blade. He dismounted with the arrogance of a man accustomed to obedience, his voice smooth yet edged with threat. He spoke of Sullivan's worry, of the town's whispers, of the reward promised for information. His words were veiled, but his eyes searched every shadow of Samuel's land. Samuel met him with steady calm, his voice level but unyielding. He spoke of solitude, of a ranch hand staying on through spring, of nothing unusual. Abigail, hidden behind the shutters, held her breath as Monroe's gaze swept the house. For a moment, fear clawed at her throat. But then Samuel stepped closer, his presence like a wall against the storm. Monroe left, suspicion lingering in his wake, and Abigail collapsed against the wall, tears of relief spilling silently. Samuel entered moments later, his hand brushing her shoulder with quiet reassurance. "You are safe," he said, and though she knew danger still prowled, she believed him. That evening, as the fire burned low, Abigail finally spoke of her fear. She told Samuel of Sullivan's rage, of Reed's cruelty, of the years spent enduring what should never have been endured. Her voice trembled, but she did not break. She was tired of silence. Samuel listened, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists, and when she finished, he said only, "No one will take you again." The promise was simple, but in it she felt the weight of truth. It was not the hollow vow of men who sought to own her. It was the pledge of someone who understood loss, who understood love in its purest, most healing form. Outside, the valley darkened into night, the stars veiled by clouds heavy with another storm. Inside, Abigail felt something stir within her heart, fragile but undeniable. In Samuel's care, she had found more than safety. She had found the first glimpse of what it meant to be whole. The past still loomed, the future still threatened, but in that quiet house, with the fire warming the walls and Samuel's steady presence anchoring her soul, she felt ready to face whatever storms might come. And as the wind rose beyond the mountains, she closed her eyes, whispering a silent vow of her own, that she would no longer be silent, no longer be broken. Her journey had begun, and though the path ahead was uncertain, it carried with it the promise of healing, of truth, and of love reborn. The days that followed Monroe's visit were colored with both silence and unspoken tension, as if the valley itself held its breath, waiting for something to break. Abigail felt it in every heartbeat, in the way the wind moved differently through the pines, in the way Samuel lingered near the windows after dusk. Yet alongside the fear was another current, warmer and strangely healing, a rhythm of life within Samuel's house that wrapped her in fragile safety. She learned to move through the rooms as though they belonged to her, lighting candles at dusk, sweeping dust from corners, placing wildflowers in small jars she found tucked away in cupboards. It was not much, but it made her feel alive again. Not a prisoner of someone else's will, but a woman shaping small moments of her own choosing. Samuel noticed the changes with quiet satisfaction. He never spoke of it, but his gaze softened whenever she arranged the hearth or when he returned from the fields to find the table set with care. He moved with the weight of a man who had carried too much sorrow, yet Abigail began to see glimpses of something gentler beneath his silence. Sometimes at twilight he would sit on the porch with his pipe and watch the sun paint the mountains. If she joined him, he would share stories, not of war, not of loss, but of the land itself, the way the seasons shifted, the way spring brought green hope even after the harshest winters. His words carried the cadence of healing, a reminder that even after fire and ruin, life found a way to return. One morning, the valley lay washed in dew, the earth softened by a night of rain. Abigail walked into the meadow, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her bare feet damp with grass. The world smelled of freshness, of beginnings, and for the first time since her mother's passing, she felt her spirit unclench. She knelt among the flowers and whispered a prayer not of desperation but of gratitude, for survival, for Samuel's rescue, for the chance to breathe air that did not taste of smoke or whiskey. When she returned to the house, Samuel was waiting, his hands still dusted with soil from tending the horses. He looked at her as though she carried the sunrise in her hair, and though neither spoke, something passed between them, quiet as the breath of wind through leaves. As Abigail's strength grew, so too did her questions. Sullivan's lies pressed heavier upon her mind, especially the ones about her mother. There were nights when she stared into the fire and wondered what truths had been buried, what secrets still chained her to a past she did not fully understand. Samuel, watching her with the patience of a man who knew time was its own healer, said little, but inside him the storm raged. The photograph of Clara burned in his thoughts, her likeness mirrored in Abigail's every gesture, every word. He longed to tell her, to unburden his heart, but fear kept him still. What if the truth shattered her? What if the revelation was more weight than she could carry in her fragile healing? So he waited, holding his silence like a blade that cut him with every passing day. Martha returned one afternoon, her presence like a steadying hand against the gathering storm. She brought clothing for Abigail, simple dresses mended with care, and news from town. Sullivan, she said, had grown desperate. He spoke louder now of betrayal, of debts unpaid, weaving stories that painted Abigail as both thief and temptress. Reed, still nursing the wound she had given him, prowled the saloon with venom in his eyes. The sheriff, loyal to coin rather than justice, had begun to spread Sullivan's reward more widely, tempting the desperate with silver. Abigail listened with her chin lifted, though fear gnawed inside her. Yet when she met Samuel's gaze across the room, steady and unyielding, she found strength in his certainty. His silence was not absence. It was a promise that he would not let her be taken. That evening, as the firelight softened the walls, Abigail dared to ask Samuel the question that had lived in her heart since the night he saved her. "Why did you help me?" Her voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. Samuel looked at her for a long time, his eyes storm-grey, and answered in the simplest way, "Because your life matters." The words were more than kindness. They were a balm, a healing truth she had never heard spoken without condition. No bargains, no debts, no chains, only worth, only care. Tears burned her eyes, and though she turned away quickly, Samuel saw them, and his chest ached with the weight of both love and truth. The days became threads woven together, fragile yet strong. Abigail cooked when she could, mended what was torn, and read aloud in the evenings. Samuel worked the land, his presence solid, his silence a shield. Together they carved a rhythm that felt almost like family, almost like home. Yet shadows gathered beyond the valley, whispers of Sullivan's fury growing sharper, Reed's vengeance deepening. Abigail sensed it, the way animals sense storms before the first crack of thunder. And though her heart found healing within Samuel's care, she knew their peace could not last. Still, in those moments, she allowed herself to dream. She imagined the seamstress shop her mother had once spoken of, curtains fluttering at the bay window, the scent of lavender drifting through the air. She imagined laughter not tainted by cruelty, evenings filled with the sound of music instead of drunken shouts. She imagined a life where love was not a cage, but a gift. And sometimes, when Samuel's hand brushed hers as he passed her a book, or steadying her when she grew tired, she imagined what it might have been like to grow up with him by her side, a father's love shaping her instead of Sullivan's chains. The valley darkened into night, and as Abigail lay beneath the quilt, her heart carried both hope and fear. Healing had begun, but the truth still waited like a storm behind the mountains. Soon, she knew, the past would demand to be reckoned with. And though she could not see the road ahead, she felt the quiet promise in Samuel's presence, that whatever lay before them, they would not face it alone. The night whispered softly through the rafters, and with it came the fragile certainty that even in the shadow of danger, the seeds of freedom had already been planted, waiting to bloom. The morning broke with a hush that seemed almost fragile, as though the valley itself knew a new weight rested upon its shoulders. The air was cool, washed clean by the night's drizzle, and Abigail stood by the window of Samuel's house, watching the fog drift across the fields like pale ghosts. Her chest rose and fell steadily, no longer plagued by fever, but her heart carried storms of its own. Sullivan's lies lingered in her memory like smoke, and she could not shake the image of Reed's scarred face bent close to hers at the saloon. Yet, even with shadows pressing at the edges of her thoughts, here she stood in a house that felt like sanctuary, her body mending, her spirit stirring with something she had thought long buried: hope. Samuel moved quietly about the kitchen, preparing oatmeal sweetened with honey. His hands were steady, every gesture born of care rather than obligation, and Abigail found herself watching him as one might watch the steady flame of a lantern in the dark. He was not a man of many words, but silence with him was never empty. It was filled with unspoken promises, with the quiet presence of someone who carried more weight than he revealed. When he set the bowl before her, their fingers brushed, and she felt the warmth of his touch linger far longer than the moment itself. It was not the warmth of possession, nor the grasp of demand. It was healing, steadying, like a reminder that she was not alone in this world. Later that day, Samuel led her outside to walk the pasture. The air smelled of wet earth and wildflowers, the sky breaking open with patches of sunlight that spilled across the valley. Abigail's steps were slow, her body still regaining its strength, but she revelled in the freedom of open space, the way her skirts brushed against the grass, the sound of larks singing from the cottonwoods. Samuel walked beside her, not rushing, his presence anchoring her as surely as the earth beneath her feet. She paused at the fence line, resting her hand upon the wood worn smooth by years of use, and gazed at the horses grazing in calm rhythm. For the first time in so long, she felt no eyes upon her but her own, no gaze measuring her worth, no voice demanding obedience. Only the steady breath of the land, the quiet reassurance that healing could be found even here, among scars. That evening, Martha Hawkins visited again, bringing bread still warm from her oven. Her sharp eyes softened when she looked at Abigail, noting the colour return to her cheeks. Over tea, Martha spoke of the town, her words edged with truth as sharp as flint. Sullivan's rage had grown louder, his claims more desperate. He had told half the valley that Abigail was a thief, that she had betrayed him. Yet beneath the noise, Martha whispered of cracks in his mask, men in town beginning to doubt his story, women shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. "Lies wear thin," Martha said, her voice firm. "Truth always waits, child. It waits like a seed beneath winter, patient, certain that spring will come." Abigail clung to those words as though they were a promise from her mother's lips, feeling their healing weight settle deep within her. That night, when Martha had gone and the fire burned low, Abigail found herself restless. She stood by the window, the moonlight spilling silver across the valley, and Samuel joined her in silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, her voice barely above a whisper, Abigail said, "I sometimes wonder if my life was meant only for suffering. If perhaps I was born to be broken." Samuel turned to her, his eyes storm-grey, yet filled with quiet fire. "No life is born for suffering," he said, his voice low but steady. "You are not broken, Abigail. You are surviving. There is a difference, and survival is where healing begins." The words struck deep, and tears she had long suppressed rose unbidden. She pressed her hand to her lips, ashamed. But Samuel's hand came to rest upon her shoulder, firm and unwavering. "Let yourself grieve," he said softly. "Grief is not weakness. It is proof you have loved, proof you still hope." She let the tears fall then, silently at first, then with trembling release, years of suppressed pain pouring out in that quiet house. And Samuel did not look away. He stood with her, strong and steady, as if his presence alone could hold her together. In that moment, she felt not abandoned, not unseen, but carried, as though some part of her burden had shifted onto his shoulders. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Abigail's laughter returned in fragments, soft at first, like shy birdsong, then freer as the days warmed. She sang once while tending the fire, her voice low and clear, and Samuel paused at the doorway, his chest aching with memory. It was Clara's voice all over again, a ghost rising through Abigail's lips. He turned away quickly, his throat tight, but he could not deny the truth pressing harder with each passing day. This was no coincidence. The blood of his past lived in her, and one day, soon, he would have to speak it aloud. Yet Abigail, too, felt something shifting within. She began to dream not only of escape, but of belonging, of a life where mornings meant sunlight on the porch, where evenings meant reading by the fire, where laughter was not punished but welcomed. She knew danger waited beyond the valley, that Sullivan and Reed would not rest, but she allowed herself this fragile reprieve. Healing was not forgetting. It was allowing joy to bloom even in the cracks of sorrow. And with Samuel's steady presence, she began to believe she could face the storms yet to come. The valley breathed with summer's promise, but beneath the warmth, clouds of truth gathered. Samuel's silence grew heavier, his eyes more haunted when they lingered on her face. Abigail felt it too, an unspoken weight between them, a secret pressing against the walls of the house. The days were filled with gentle peace, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent, a river of truth waiting to break its banks. And as the sun dipped lower each evening, painting the land in fire and gold, Abigail sensed that the healing she had found here was only the beginning. The past had not finished with her, nor with Samuel, and soon the valley itself would bear witness to revelations that could shatter or save them both. The night deepened, stars scattered like shards of glass across the sky. Within the small house, Abigail lay awake beneath Samuel's quilt, her heart no longer only afraid, but also alive. The world beyond might hunt her, but here, in this fragile sanctuary, she had begun to feel the truth of her own worth, of her right to breathe, to heal, to be free. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but tonight she let the warmth of hope rest in her chest, as steady as Samuel's footsteps moving softly through the hall. Outside, the river whispered in the darkness, carrying away the last echoes of fear, and the valley slept beneath its healing hush. The storm clouds gathered again over the mountains, thick and heavy, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of change. Abigail stood on the porch of Samuel's house, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, gazing out across the valley as the sky bruised into shades of indigo and grey. She felt the wind press against her skin, cool and restless, and it mirrored the turmoil within her heart. Healing had carried her far from the night of the river, far from the grasp of Sullivan's cruelty. Yet each day seemed to bring her closer to truths she could no longer ignore. She had begun to see it in Samuel's eyes, the weight of something unspoken, the shadow of a story he had not yet dared to tell. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a soft glow across the wooden walls. Samuel moved with deliberate quiet, setting tools aside, brushing dust from his hands, his face solemn in the flicker of lamplight. Abigail watched him when she thought he would not notice. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way his silence held more meaning than words. It was not the silence of distance, but of restraint, as though every moment he fought the urge to reveal what his heart had long hidden. That evening the valley was visited once more by Martha Hawkins, bringing with her both bread and whispers. She entered with the ease of one who had become part of their fragile circle of trust. Her eyes, sharp as always, studied Abigail with warmth. "You're stronger," Martha said, pouring tea. "Colour's back in your cheeks. You look more like Clara every day." The words struck like a bell in Abigail's heart. Clara. Her mother's name was a balm and a wound all at once. She glanced at Samuel, and in his stillness she saw confirmation of something she could not yet name. Later, after Martha had gone and the house fell back into its hush, Abigail found herself seated by the fire while Samuel leaned against the mantel, shadows cutting across his weathered face. The silence stretched between them, filled with the rhythm of flames, until at last she spoke. "You knew my mother, didn't you?" The words were not accusation, but plea, trembling with need. Samuel's jaw tightened, his eyes closing for the briefest moment before he answered, his voice rough as gravel. "Yes. Long before you were born, I knew her. More than that, I loved her." The confession hung in the room like smoke, filling every corner. Abigail's breath caught, her heart hammering. She had always felt a tether between them, but hearing her mother's name upon his lips unravelled something deep inside her. "She never spoke of you," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "She only said my father was a good man who would have loved me very much." Samuel's eyes met hers then, and in them was a storm, grief, longing, hope. "She spoke truth," he said quietly. "I would have loved you. From the very first moment I would have." Abigail's hands trembled as she pressed them to her lap. Tears welled, unbidden, though they did not fall. The pieces of her past shifted, rearranged themselves into a pattern she had never dared to imagine. The cruelty of Sullivan's lies, the weight of his betrayal, pressed sharper now. Yet beneath it all she felt something she had not known she craved: belonging. Healing did not always arrive as peace. Sometimes it came as truth, raw and overwhelming, yet necessary. Samuel spoke then of years past, of a war that had torn men apart, of a house burned, of a love lost. His voice broke when he spoke Clara's name, but he continued, telling of the fire, of believing her gone, of carrying grief across the years until it carved itself into his bones. Abigail listened, her chest aching with every word. Her mother's silence made sense now, her quiet sorrow, her unwillingness to speak of the past. She had been protecting her daughter with half-truths, binding her to safety even at the cost of her own peace. The fire crackled low, the room heavy with memory. Abigail finally rose, crossing the space between them. She placed her trembling hand in Samuel's, her eyes shining, though her cheeks were wet with tears. "If what you say is true," she whispered, her voice unsteady but certain, "then you are the father I never knew. And I think I have always felt it." Samuel's hand closed around hers, strong and steady, though his own tears glistened in the light. "Blood may bind us," he said softly, "but love is what makes us whole. And Abigail, I swear to you, whatever storms lie ahead, you will never face them alone again." The words settled into her like the warmth of the fire, like healing that seeped into the deepest wounds. For so long she had lived as though unseen, a pawn in Sullivan's game, a shadow in her own story. But now, standing in Samuel's house, hearing the truth of her blood, she felt as though she had been given back something stolen at birth: a father's love, a place to belong, a promise that the chains of her past did not define her future. Outside, the storm broke at last, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rolling across the mountains. But inside, Abigail felt only calm. The truth had come, and though it brought with it pain and questions yet unanswered, it also carried the first light of freedom. She leaned into Samuel's embrace, letting her tears fall against his shoulder, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt whole. Healing had not been swift nor simple, but it had come, like rain upon parched earth, like dawn breaking after a night too long. And as the storm raged beyond the valley, Abigail closed her eyes and breathed deeply, knowing that the journey ahead would be perilous, yet no longer hers to walk alone. Truth had bound her to Samuel, and in that bond lay not only healing, but the strength to face the reckoning that was surely coming. The firelight flickered, the rain fell steady, and within the quiet house, father and daughter clung to one another as the storm outside passed into the night, carrying with it the weight of years gone by and the fragile promise of days yet to come. The storm had left the valley drenched and trembling, its echoes still rumbling across the mountains, as Abigail awoke to a world washed clean. The morning light spilled gently through the shutters, tender as a mother's hand upon her brow, and for a long moment she simply lay still, listening to the hush that followed thunder. The house smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of wild flowers Samuel had set in a jar by her bedside. Each breath she drew was steady now, no longer burdened with fever, and her heart beat with a rhythm she scarcely recognized. Hope, fragile yet alive. She rose, her bare feet brushing against the cool wooden floor, and wrapped herself in a shawl before stepping softly into the main room. Samuel was already awake, seated by the fire with a book resting forgotten in his lap. His gaze lifted when she entered, and for a moment the storm grey of his eyes softened into something almost luminous. There was no need for words. The silence between them spoke of revelations laid bare, of truths once buried now rising like dawn. He had told her of Clara, of love stolen by war and deceit, and in that telling something within her had shifted forever. No longer did she carry the weight of not belonging, of being nothing more than Sullivan's pawn. She was her mother's daughter and Samuel's child, bound by blood and by love. The hours of that day unfolded with a gentleness that felt like healing itself. They shared a meal by the window, the rain still dripping from the eaves, the land shimmering with new life. Abigail laughed softly when Samuel's horse nuzzled against her shoulder, searching for grain, and the sound startled them both. It was the kind of laugh that had been stolen from her for years, locked away by fear, and now it returned as naturally as breath. Samuel's lips curved into a smile, small but filled with wonder, as though he had been waiting all his life to hear it. As the afternoon waned, Martha Hawkins rode up the trail, her figure sharp against the silver horizon. She carried news of town. Sullivan's anger burned brighter than ever, his lies growing desperate, his hold on redemption fraying at the edges. Reed prowled like a wounded wolf, his scar a reminder of the night Abigail had defied him. Yet in Martha's voice was also hope. Whispers that not all believed Sullivan's tale, that some in town had begun to doubt the story of theft and betrayal. The truth, like a seed, had begun to stir beneath the soil of lies. When Martha departed, leaving behind food and her steadying presence, Samuel turned to Abigail with a weight in his eyes. "We cannot hide forever," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Sullivan will not stop, nor will Reed. The time will come when we must step into the light, with the truth as our shield." Abigail nodded, her heart steady. She was no longer the girl caged in Sullivan's saloon, no longer the trembling voice forced into silence. She had survived betrayal, river, storm. She had found her father, and now she would find her freedom. That night, as the firelight bathed the room in gold, Abigail sat beside Samuel, her hand resting gently on his. The weight of years separated them, yet in that moment they were bound not by time but by love's quiet persistence. She spoke of her dreams, the little shop by the sea her mother had once described, curtains of blue fluttering in the breeze, the sound of gulls overhead. Samuel listened, his face tender in the glow, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he promised with the steadiness of his soul that he would see her safe. The valley outside was quiet now, the stars emerging timidly after the storm, their light scattered across the heavens like blessings. Abigail leaned against Samuel's shoulder, her eyes closing as peace settled over her. She knew danger had not vanished, that Sullivan's rage and Reed's cruelty would not fade easily, but she also knew she was no longer alone. Healing had taken root within her heart. Love had bound her to truth, and hope whispered of days yet to come. And so, beneath the hush of the Montana night, Abigail allowed herself to rest, not in fear, but in trust. The journey was far from over, but already the storms that once sought to drown her had become part of her strength. Whatever trials awaited, she would meet them with the courage of her mother's spirit and the steadfast love of the father she had finally found. If this story has touched your heart, if the journey of Abigail's healing and hope has brought you even a moment of warmth, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Leave a comment, let your voice join hers, and if you wish to continue walking with these characters as their tale unfolds, please like this story and subscribe. Your presence here is more than support. It is a light in the storm, a gentle reminder that stories of love and healing are never told in vain.